Hello and welcome to the technical teaching video for the Sony FX6 at the Department of Film and Television, University of Bristol. This camera is going to be available for you in Year 2 and Year 3 for your practical projects. Okay, so to start with, the first thing that we want to do is get power to the camera and put the card in, and in order to do that we're going to need to show you how to navigate the menu on this camera. So to start with, the battery has a series of sockets with copper that fit to the pins in the back of the camera, and if you take the battery and pop it in, it goes in and then slides down to connect, and then to release it there's a button just at the top left hand part of the battery socket. You press that in, you slide the battery up and it comes out. So in, down and lock. Okay, then we need to put a card into the camera, and we use these SD cards. When you put it in, you open the slot on the back here, take the card, the label faces the battery, slide it in there. So now we have battery on, card in. We're going to power up the camera, and the power switch is just on the back, right underneath the slot where the cards go in, and you slide that forward and you will see a green light comes on and the screen powers up. So on the FX6 there are two ways to navigate the menu. On the front of the camera, underneath the ND preset button, there's a circular dial, and that navigates the menu. But also on the handle, if you put your hand into the handle, there's a button there that has the number 5 on it, and just to the left of that there's a button that toggles left and right. Sometimes these toggles on the front left hand side can become a little bit difficult to use, and so in that case use the one on the handle. But in order to access the menu, there is a menu button right here, and in order to access the full menu you need to press and hold. If you just tap the menu you get a shortcut menu, and we're going to talk about that right at the end. But for the moment I want you to press and hold the full button, and you'll see that the menu pops up on the screen, and you see that on the touch screen here. Now, the first thing we're going to do every time we switch these cameras on is check the clock and the date, okay? Time and date. Now, sometimes when you switch the cameras on, it will automatically prompt you to do that, but you cannot assume that that is set correctly. And it makes a real difference to your workflow when it comes to the edit, because if you are filming on one particular day and the editor thinks you were filming on, say, Friday the 5th of November, but the camera hasn't recorded that information correctly, the editor's going to struggle to find the footage. Likewise, you might be filming in the UK and then travel to the US or to a different time zone. And if you don't change those settings, you're going to end up confusing the edit. And it's really important because of the way that we use timecode on these cameras. So I've got the menu up, and you'll see that there's a sort of first level of the menu on the left and a deeper level here. So in order to access the clock, I'm going to use the toggle on the handle, and I'm going to travel down all the way to maintenance. And you'll see here in maintenance you have language, clock set, and some other options here. So we're going to go in, we're going to leave that in English, go to clock set, go across. Now, the time zone is Greenwich, that's fine because we're in the UK. Date mode, leave that as year, month and date, and leave the 24-hour clock as the option. That again is to do with the information in the edit. We're going to go here to the date, and today is actually 2025, it's February and it's the 17th. Okay, so I'm going to set that. The time is currently set to 17 minutes past 11 at night, and it is currently now 9. So the clock here is set to 11:17 at night, and it's currently 9:54 in the morning, so I'm going to reset that. Okay, and I'm going to go to set and activate that. Okay, so now my clock is correctly set. That means that the data that the edit is looking at is relevant to the shoot that you're doing. Okay, so it's really important. And don't assume, just because you don't get that warning message saying, please check the clock, don't assume that the clock is set correctly. Please go in and check that every time. Remember, if you leave the battery off for any length of time, the clock will reset. So it's a procedural thing that every time you work with it, you need to double check that that clock is correctly set. So the next thing to do is to set up the clip naming format and format this card. Okay, so if we leave this item on the menu and we go back to the left-hand menu and we go up to timecode media. Okay, now timecode should be preset, free run, and again, we want to set this to the time of day. And I'll explain the logic for that shortly, but if we go in here, we're going to set it to 9, and then it's currently moved on. It's now 9:55, so I'm going to go across, I'm going to select set, and if I take the menu off, you'll now see here your time code is running. Okay, 9:55:10. So I'm going to go back into menu, press and hold, the menu comes up, and now I'm going to go to clip name format. So you can see here the clip name format is set to title, that's correct, title prefix, and this is the information we want to change. Now what we want to do is label it with a project name, that's the first in letters here. Then we want our date in here, and the reason that we want the date in there is that when we sort these clips, they'll sort in order. I label it with the camera and then a letter that indicates which camera you're using, because you may have 2 or 3. So let's go in and do that. So the project is going to be technical video, so I'm going to call it TV. Okay, the date is it's the 17th of February, so I'm going to go 25/02/17. Okay, and then finally, this is camera A, so I'm going to designate that as A. Okay, there we go. So, TV 25/02/17 FX6A. Think about your project title. It needs to be unique to you, so not your unit title, but your project title. So maybe it's Group 3 Graduate Practical Project or something like that. So it could be GPP_G3, but come up with a distinct title for your clips. The other thing that we need to do is reset now the numbers, and you need to do this every day. Because it will be specific to the day, and I'm resetting that to 001. So now every day you have the date that you're filming on and your clips restart at 1, and you don't need to change that again during the day. Now the reason that we do this is because we are using time code that is running at the time of day. So if we have the menu off. Now if you're shooting over multiple days, you could end up with the same time code on multiple days, okay, because it's running at time of day. The logic for using time of day is that it means it's very easy to track what you were doing when, okay? You know that at 10 o'clock you were filming scene 3, and when you're logging the information, you can go back to your call sheet and refer to that for your timings. So it's good practice in terms of logging. However, there is a risk that you duplicate time codes because you're filming on multiple days. And that is where using the clip name format, it becomes so important. Every day has a different clip name because you are entering the date into it. And that is really good practice and standard across industry. So that's what we would like you to use. So Now I have got the battery on, the card in, I've checked my clock and my time and date is correct. I've set up my clip naming and I've reset my numbers. I'm going to go and format the card. So down to format media, go across to media A, always do a full format. Now this becomes really important because if you're collecting a card, you may have a card that has footage from a previous project on it. That's going to mean that your card fills up more quickly, and when you digitize that onto Lucid Link or the edit system, you're going to end up having to digitize the previous project's footage as well as your own. So that's the basic setup to make sure you've got power on the camera, you've got a card in that's formatted, your metadata, the clip naming is correct, and your time code is set. So now we're ready to go to the next level of settings for the camera. So the next thing to look at is the settings we want you to use in camera for codec and recording. If you go to the YouTube page, there is actually a lot more detail in terms of the external videos that we've collated, where you can really look in great depth at all of the technical information for some of these settings and inform yourself about the choices. But to start with, we want you to use the settings that we're going to run through here. So the first thing is to switch the menu on. And you'll see it appears here as user. We want to go down to project and we go across and we go to base setting. Now there are two modes here. There is custom and Cine EI. My preference is for you to use Cine EI, and that's really to do with the way that the information is recorded more cleanly in this mode as far as I'm concerned. If we go down to rec format, now frequency 25 frames per second. We are filming in the UK and our basic frame rate should be 25 frames per second. That's because our electrical cycle is on 50 Hertz, and so 25 frames per second arises out of that. It means that there's no strobing on the image. In America, the electrical cycle is on 60 Hertz and they tend to use 30 frames per second. There's a lot more information about this in the video on general principles of camera work, and again you can delve into YouTube if you want more detail on that. But basically 25 frames per second. Now these cameras do have quite a neat mode, which is the imager scan mode, where you can select full frame or Super 35. Super 35 will crop the image, so you can't record a 4K image. You can only record a 4K image in full frame mode. Codec, we want you to be on XAVCI. There is various options on this, but just ignore those for the moment. Now the camera here is currently set at 4K. On the whole, we prefer you to use HD, which is 1920 1080. If you do want to use 4K, you're going to end up with much more data and larger files, and it's going to be much harder to manage in post. So please do check in with your tutors if you want to use 4K. There's no real reason for it. The HD is perfectly good enough quality for all of the projects that you're going to deliver. Good enough for projection in a cinema, good enough for projection on almost all TV screens. But if you want to use the higher resolution, you would select it under video format. But I would prefer you to use HD. It just means your data files are smaller and more manageable. So I'm going to execute that, and you'll see that that's switched here. But if I turn the menu off, you'll also see that the information is up here. Full frame, 1920 1080, 25p, XAVCI. So it's stored on the viewfinder when you're looking at it as well. So now you're correctly set up. Frequency 25 frames per second, codec XAVCI, video format 1920 by 1080. You're going to go down here to Cine EI and you're going to set the color gamut. And I would like you to use S gamut 3, Cine S log 3. And the reason for using a log is that it preserves much more of the information about the image. If you use a LUT, you're throwing away quite a lot of information. But we do want to make sure that you embed the LUT file, and that means that the edit suite will know that you're using a LUT. And so the final thing that we need to set up is we need to go to shooting menu here on the left, go across, go down all the way to LUT on off. Now, you definitely want the LUT on for the SDI and the HDMI, and you definitely want it on for the viewfinder and the proxy. You definitely want it off for internal record, because if you switch that on, the LUT is going to be burnt into the image. At the moment, the way we have it set up is it's going to record S-log, but it's going to tell the edit that you used a LUT on it. So the edit will know that information and automatically apply it. However, you're not recording that onto the card, so you're preserving the maximum amount of information about the quality of the image. So that is the basic settings that we would like you to use for this camera. As I say, our preference is to shoot HD because it just means a lot less data in the edit system. If you do want to use 4K for any reason, please talk to your tutors about it and discuss that with them. So now we're ready to shoot. The big question is how to make sure the image is in focus and how to make sure it's exposed properly. Well, first thing that we're going to do is take the lens cap off the camera, and we're going to take the hood off by rotating it. We're going to turn it on, line it up and twist it so it's on. A little note, please. The lens cap, that does not live in pockets, because pockets go home with you at the end of the shoot. Just to make sure we don't end up with too many cameras in bags with no lens caps, please take that lens cap and put it into the camera bag where you know it is and where you can find it easily at the end of the shoot. If you put it in a pocket, the chances are you're going to find it when you take it out of the laundry. Okay, so now we've got an image up on here. And the first thing that we're going to look at is focusing and using the lens. So these lenses have two dials on them. They have a dial to zoom the image in, and you can see that I'm zooming in and out on the light there. And the second thing is the focus. Well, at the moment, there is no tool for measuring the focus other than by eye. But if we go here on the side of the view, that has enacted peaking, and you can see, for instance, if I zoom into these objects here, you'll see that the peaking comes sharper on where there's highlights, okay? It's a kind of sparkle. Now, there are different settings for that, so if I go down to the monitoring menu here, you can see monitoring, I can go across and I can go and set up peaking in here. Now, it's on and it's high, color is black and white. You can also change that to red. So red peaking is something I find quite useful in very bright environments. I'll tend to use that outdoors, and I'll tend to use black and white or white peaking indoors because it's easier to read that way. But if you turn red peaking on, you'll see that as you make objects come into focus, there's a red line that appears on them. That's when you know that it's in focus. So that's a little tool for helping you with focusing. As I say, you have the zoom ring at the back, focus ring on the front. Now, these cameras do have really impressive autofocus functions in terms of face recognition and so on. I would encourage you, on the whole, to stay away from that. We prefer you to learn how to do it manually. So the next stage is to understand how to expose properly on these cameras. Now, if you go to the general principles of camera work, there's a bit more detail in there. We talk about the exposure triangle, which is ISO, shutter, and aperture. The other element that comes into aperture is the neutral density filter. Okay, so the first thing is shutter, and if we go to the camera, now you can have auto shutter. All of these settings go to auto. Strongly discourage that. Encourage you to use manual settings. Highlighted now here, 1/50th. 1/50th is the correct setting for 25 frames per second. That's because the image is exposed for half the time and closed for half the time. So if you do that 25 times and you're exposing it and closing it 25 times, you're only actually opening the camera for 1/50th of a second, because 1/50th of the second it's open, 1/50th of the second it's closed. That's a 25th of a second. The only reason you would change that to a different setting would really be if you were getting strobing on a screen or you were filming the States, where you might want to use 1/60th. You can use higher or lower shutter, but it does affect the image. So the higher the shutter speed, the sharper the image, and the lower the shutter speed, the more blurry it is. The human eye experiences it as a proper level of focus blur around 1/50th of a second. The reason for using a higher shutter speed might be if you're filming very fast moving vehicles or something that was happening high action, very quick movements. The reason for using a slower shutter speed might be to give the effect of blur and motion, as they do in Gladiator, for example. But on the whole, we would discourage you to change the shutter. So that means, unlike in stills photography, shutter is really out of the window for us as an option in terms of exposure. So the next thing we can turn to is the ISO here, which you can see is set at 800. So if I go again to the buttons underneath the menu, there's shutter and then there's ISO. Now, there's two places where you can control this. One is in the menu and the other one is using these switches here, LMH. So if I go to those and I slide it to high, then it changes to 1250, medium is 1000, and low is 800. Okay, and you can change those basic settings by using the ISO button directly above it. However, these cameras have a base ISO setting of 800, and I would strongly discourage you from changing that, because you're not really doing yourself any favors. If you change it to a higher ISO, all you're doing is introducing noise into the image. If you choose a lower ISO, you're doing the same but in reverse. So what will happen is you'll end up with a very grainy, noisy image, especially in the dark areas. So if the image is too bright, you want to go to aperture and neutral density to control your image. If it's too dark, you want to change the shot or light the shot in order to change it. Now, the great thing about these cameras is they actually have two base settings. They have 800 and 12,800, but I'm going to come on to talk about that later. The basic principle is you don't want to change it from the base ISO setting, which on this camera is 800 in general. And again, we'll talk about the circumstances you might use 12,800 later on, but as a matter of principle, stick to the base ISO. So in a sense, we can't use shutter and we can't use ISO. So what does that leave us with to control the exposure? It's aperture and neutral density. So to control your aperture, if you go to the side of the camera here, you'll see just above menu there's a button that says iris. If you press that, then you use the circular dial at the front and you can dial in whatever aperture you want to use, and you'll see that changing here. On the whole, I prefer to stay on a fixed aperture of, and you can also control that using the toggle on your handle. Now, I tend to avoid changing my aperture as much as possible. I like working with it wide open, which on these cameras is f4. And the reason for that is that it means that the background has a slightly less depth of field and is a little bit softer. However, if I'm deciding not to change the aperture, then really what am I left with to control the exposure? Because I can't use shutter, I can't use ISO, and now I'm deciding that I'm going to keep my aperture at T4. Well, the other option, but this only applies if the image is too bright, is to use neutral density. And neutral density is, very simply put, just like a pair of sunglasses. It reduces the amount of light, but it doesn't change the quality of the image in terms of color or any other thing that might affect. It doesn't change the quality of the image. So ND is basically like sunglasses. It reduces the amount of light coming to the sensor, but it doesn't change any other information such as color. On these cameras, you have a button on the top left, just underneath the record button, that says ND preset. And you'll see at the moment, the light is underneath clear. If I add ND in, it'll add in an ND here, you'll see it an 1/8. And I can control what ND I'm using this dial, ND variable. Okay, and you can change that from 1/4 all the way up to 1/128. So it's a really great function. Now, here you can sometimes find situations where you'll actually want you to use this as ND auto, and that button is here, just in between the ND preset and the ND variable controls. If I press that, you'll see here there's a button that says ND auto, just in between the ND variable and the ND preset. If I press and hold that, you'll see an A appears next to it. Now, normally I would urge you not to use auto controls. However, the auto ND on this is so good. I've done shots where I've traveled from inside a building into very bright sunshine, and the auto ND will ride that exposure for you really, really well. But just be aware that on the whole, on these cameras, the best settings are manual. You would only want to use auto if you're actually designing a shot that needed it. So I'm going to turn it off. And because I'm in here and it's very dark, I'm also going to completely clear the ND, and you'll see that that indicator then disappears. If you're inside and it's too dark, the ND doesn't do anything for you because it only helps you reduce brighter images. So if you're inside and the image is too dark, you need to do something about that in terms of using lighting. So the final thing to think about in terms of the image is the color balance, and all controlled by this little silver toggle switch here, where you'll see at the moment it's currently on preset. You can go A and B. So if I go into the menu, I can set what those should be in terms of the presets. So the final element to think about in terms of the image is the white balance, and there's more information on white balance in the general principles of camera work video. But basically it's controlled on this camera by the toggle switch here, where you have preset A and B, and we can actually set what those are in the menu. So if I press and hold menu and I go to shooting and then across, I can control my settings for the presets here in white. So I'm going to make my preset here warm, so that's for tungsten light. Then I'm going to go here and change the switch to A, and I'm going to go down and I'm going to make that 4300, which is for mixed lighting. Then I'm going to go back, flick this to B, and I'm going to go down to B, and I'm going to make that 5600 to match daylight. So here we go, 5600. So now what you will see is if I come out of menu, and you'll see that the white balance indicator is here, WB white balance, and I've got it on 5600, but I can easily switch it between the three presets to change that. There is an alternative means, which is that you can do an auto white balance, but because you're shooting Cine EI, you don't need to do that, as the image is completely gradable and controllable in post-production. So I would encourage you to use these presets, and all those presets are really doing is telling the edit what settings you were using, but they're not really changing the image because of the way the camera is set up. Okay, so I mentioned earlier on that there are two base settings for this camera, and it's a huge advantage. The main base setting that you're going to use is 800 ISO, but you can also use a base setting of 12,800. And the simplest way to do that is through the shortcut menu, which I'm going to demonstrate now, which is a really useful tool. So rather than pressing and holding menu this time, I'm just going to tap it. And you'll see that here you get one of 10 menus that you can scroll through, and you can do that with the toggle on the handle. And it gives you some of the most important settings that you'll want to play around with. You can actually go in and change the white balance presets, and you can change here your ISO settings and so on. And the way you do this is by touching the screen. So the one that I'm going to look at with you now is here, base ISO sensitivity. If I tap on that, you'll get here. So 800 is the setting you want to use most of the time, but you can change it to 12,800. And these cameras have a system on them where they clean that image up, and it's really quite good. So you can use 12,800, but don't use it all the time. Just use it in certain situations where you need a bit of a boost in terms of exposure. And if I then tap on the touch screen here, I'll change it to 12,800, and you see the image now is much brighter, and the change to set. Now, again, when it comes to coming out of the menu, I would encourage you not to change that base setting. If you are going to be at 12,800, don't use any other ISO setting, because this is the setting that will be cleanest for your image. So if you're using ISO with your exposure, you either want to be on 12,800 or 800 and not then change that within the camera. And that's the final bit of information to share with you about this camera. You should be good to go to set the camera up, turn it on, get all your settings programmed out, and go and enjoy shooting your projects.